Hello fellow glue sniffers and sprue snippers. For this project I'm going to be making a diorama with a modified Panther 2. I'm using the Amusing Hobby Panther 2 production version, kit number 35A018. I've reviewed the prototype version of this kit as well as their Yag Panther 2 in previous videos and built them pretty much out of the box. This build will involve a fair bit of aftermarket, including metal track links, photo etch, metal barrel, 3D printed parts, as well as some modified kit parts or maybe even some scratch built parts. I'm also going to replicate both cast and rolled armor plate textures as well as add weld beads and flame cut marks to the appropriate parts. And then there's the figures. I've planned like 8 or 9 of them. And finally the base. I'm going to be doing some things I haven't done in a very long time, and possibly some techniques I've never even tried before. The kit builds up well, so I won't bore you with the normal cutting, cleaning up, and gluing stuff. I'll just concentrate on the overall improvements in the aftermarket. The complex kit tracks will be replaced by a set of Furl model working metal track links. I have this set that's already been burnished. Set numbers ATL-37. These are for the later Tiger 2 and being full width and are significantly wider than the kit's Tiger 2 transport type tracks. This means that if I use these much wider tracks, I won't be able to use the PE side skirts without lengthening the mounting brackets and widening the fenders. As of this recording, I'm probably going to go with no fenders or mounts at all and just the tool racks on the side and give it a fairly clean look, although chunky with the tracks sticking out the sides. The kit photo etch will be replaced with Voyager PE set PE35869. This is their basic set and includes parts for the anti-aircraft armor over the turret roof and the engine deck screen. The biggest change to the kit is this replacement turret. It's a 3D printed turret I found on Shapeways for the Panther 2 Rheinstahl Hanomag cast turret. It's a perfect fit to the kit turret ring and spins easily with no binding right out of the package. I thought it was a very unique design and certainly possible, though I'd never heard of a cast turret even being proposed for the Panther, never mind the Panther 2. I ordered mine in natural white plastic, the cheapest option, as I didn't see any cast texture on the rendering and I was planning on replicating a cast texture anyway. And lastly, well so far, I've got an aluminum Aber KWK43 L71 88mm barrel for it. I had to modify this one a bit to make it fit. I trimmed the end and wrapped it with tape to make up for the difference in sizing. And yes, it even has simulated rifling. Aber part number is 35L-97. First off, the drive sprocket and idler wheels are missing some cast texture. These pictures I printed off are from the only Panther 2 chassis ever made and show this casting texture is present. The kit's parts are pretty smooth, but that's an easy fix. I'll use a putty and stipple technique for the cast texture. First, we need to identify which area of the parts are supposed to have the cast texture and which areas are supposed to be machined flat for assembly on the real thing. Both wheels have a machined hub. The idler is machined smooth along the strengthening ribs in the outer rim, and the backside should be cast. The drive sprocket had its outer rim machined smooth for the tooth section to be installed. After gluing the drive sprockets together, we have a bit of a seam to deal with as well as the smooth surface, so I'll turn these simple stock looking wheels into something a little more interesting using a cast texture. What I use for my process: Vallejo masking fluid, Testors liquid cement, Tamiya basic putty. Other brands will work as well, but this is what I use. I prefer Testors liquid cement as it's a very slow drying cement compared to most other brands. I find it great for slow setting applications like this where extended working time is desired. I have an old brush I cut very short that I use for stippling. I'm also using a toothpick to apply the masking fluid. If you use a brush, it'll tend to just gum the brush up and you'll have to throw it out. After shaking the masking fluid well, I applied it to the part as liberally but as neatly as I could. It's easy to clean up if you slop though, so don't worry about it too much. You could also trim the excess film away with a sharp knife after it dries if that works better for you. Don't worry too much about air bubbles either. Most of them will pop on their own, and as long as there's some masking fluid under the bubble, it'll be fine. Once done, I put on a level surface to dry. When doing the idler outers, fill in the depression around the hub up to where the spokes start. Don't worry about covering up the spokes, they'll be sanded smooth later. Same deal with the drive sprockets. Coat the center hub and the entire outer race of the wheel just to the edge of the rim. After allowing the masking fluid to dry completely, I started the stippling process. I use a small amount of putty, mix it with enough liquid cement to make the putty the consistency I want. In this case, I want something a bit like drywall mud to something a bit like slightly runny toothpaste. Once mixed, I just slather it onto the part and start stippling in a random up and down motion. That's it. That's all there is to it. I add more putty mix as I go, manipulating it around where I want it, adding cement to keep the consistency where desired. Once I'm happy, I move on. If it doesn't look right when it's dry, I can always redo it easy enough. Testers dries fairly slowly, as you can see, so I have plenty of time to get the effect I want. I didn't really want a rough look. I mostly move up and down for stippling, but the sides of the idler spokes get some cast texture as well, so I painted some putty mix in there and stippled it also. Goes without saying, gloves are highly recommended for this. I did both sides of all three parts of each idler wheel, even though a lot of it will hardly be seen. Doing this before assembly is a lot easier than doing it when they're all together. The drive sprockets got the same treatment. There's the seam from assembling the two drive sprocket halves. I've cleaned them up, even though the stippling process can easily be used to make this vanish. Same process for mixing the putty and liquid cement. Next day, the putty is hardened completely and the masking can be removed. The texture is just what I wanted. Rough enough, but not too rough. I checked all the parts before removing the mask to make sure I'm happy with my work. It'll be pretty hard to get back in to fix something once the wheel is assembled. Sorry ASMR fans, didn't go quite as planned. I eventually found the easiest way to remove the mask was just to use an old toothbrush. See the difference? Done, cleaned up, and assembled. Much more interesting than the smooth kit parts. Here's an idea of what they'll look like when painted. This is Tamiya XF89 Dark Green 2. This texture should really pop once it's weathered. Dry sprockets will look great too, and that seam is nowhere to be seen. Now that I've got all the wheels and suspension done, I'm going to work on the flame cuts and weld seams. Many plates on the real vehicle were cut with flame torches, which leave distinctive marks. These are missing from the kit in many places where it's not practical for them to be molded in. Weld seams are also missing from some of the interlocking plates. The welds actually wrap around these parts. There's a weld seam that goes here between the whole side and the lower glacis plate that's missing. Here's the other side completed, including the flame cuts. I'm going to replicate these with epoxy putty. I used the same method as Night Shift, so it shouldn't be new to many of you. I use Tamiya smooth epoxy putty, but many other brands will work as well. I made my own stylus, and you use it in a poking kind of motion to replicate the weld bead. This is a two-part putty that uses equal amounts of each type. The exact amounts aren't critical, but it can affect your curing time. Remove the putty from the package and only remove a little more than what you think you'll use in total. It sets up fairly slowly and you can always mix up more, but once it's mixed, the clock is ticking. Mix well and roll into a small roll, 2 millimeters or smaller. Line up the finished roll on the seam. I use the tool to position the roll where I want. Once it's in place, I start using short, gentle pressing motions and press the putty into the crack, moving back a tiny amount before repeating, and then continuing that until the bead is done. I haven't done this in over a decade, but I think it looks reasonably passable, although a bit heavier than I was hoping for. Now for the interlocking plates. The technique is the same, the epoxy roll is just a lot smaller, as are the pressing motions. These are a lot trickier to do than the straight beads. I did the flame cuts next, only because I'm an idiot and I should have actually done them first. The kit parts are smooth due to molding limitations, but these are super easy to do. The first part is to figure out which parts are flame cut and where. Some parts are supposed to have machined edges, so check your references. All you need is some liquid cement, guess my favorite, a brush to apply it, and a decently pointy hobby knife. Don't use a new blade or the tip will probably break off. I apply a decent amount of glue to the part. I want enough to start melting the surface, but I don't want it running down the sides. I give it a few seconds to work, and then I use the back of the knife tip and drag it backwards over the part using a little bit of force. Flame cuts are fairly subtle, small ridges, not so much like big saw marks. I keep the blade moving as I go, going back and forth over the part until I'm satisfied with the effect. Once done, I can give the part either a light brushing of Tamiya Extra Thin or lightly rub some 4/0 or 4/0 steel wool to smooth it down a bit if I had overdone anything. Next up, I replicated the rolled armor texture using pretty much the same technique as cast texture, but you just keep the putty mix quite a bit runnier. I masked off the areas I wanted left smooth and used Vallejo liquid mask where needed to protect the existing finish. As you can see, this mix is much wetter with more glue added. It still evaporates fairly quickly, but not like Tamiya Extra Thin. I put a light thin coat on as I'll add several layers to get the effect that I want. I don't have to wait in between layers either, I just can't lay it on too thick or it can crack or craze, meaning crackle the plastic. I apply it like stippling, but I move faster and I keep the movements much more random. I'm not looking for nearly as rough a finish as a cast texture. This should be much smoother. Once the first coat is set up, I start on the second. A bit more random, a bit thicker here, a bit thinner there. I tried to keep the texture pretty thin, but noticeable. Again, for the ASMR, it didn't work out as hoped, but the texture looks great now. A light sanding, and it'll be ready to go. And that's it for this week. As you can see, it's a lot further along than I left off at. You'll see that and more. I hope I can condense it all into one video that's not much longer than half an hour. I'm really hoping. And we'll see you in a couple of weeks. Talk to you later, everybody.